Hello and welcome back to the Sex and Healing podcast. I'm your host, Erin Kyna, and thank you so much for joining me as we take a wild ride together through the realms of sex and healing. Today's episode is all about the problems of being poly, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. No doubt there will be future episodes where I talk about more problems of being poly. And I certainly hope to share more episodes in the future about the rewards and the benefits of being poly. But this is certainly some of the problems that my partner and I are navigating right now. If you haven't already, I really invite you to subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you enjoy it, I would love if you left a 5-star written review. And of course, if there's someone in your world that you think would benefit from this episode, then please do share the love. So when we look at poly, we cannot not look at monogamy. There are only 17% on average human cultures that are strictly monogamous. So that means actually the vast majority of the world is existing in some sort of poly dynamics. We, most likely, myself and the person listening, you, my beloved listener, were most likely raised in a culture where monogamy was the norm. So it can feel very exclusive to live in a monogamous world and feel like you might not fit in that. But when we broaden our perspective, when we zoom out a little bit, then we can actually see that the majority of the world lives this way. When we look at the species of mammals, of which we humans are included, there are only 3 to 5% of the roughly 5,000 species of mammals that are known to form lifelong or monogamous bonds. So when we look at those statistics, when we look at those expectations, when we look at the judgment that might be placed upon us if we're not monogamous, or if we want something non-conventional, then we can see we're already kind of doomed. That doesn't really equate to success. So before we even start, we're looking at a problem because our expectations of relationship based on what society has told us are already problematic when we look at the statistics of relationships across the planet. And then when we also look at the statistics of the success rates of marriage. And by no means is marriage the standard or the definition of monogamy, but for simplicity's sake, we will use marriage as a statistic here, that we see roughly 50% of marriages end in divorce. So there's nothing wrong with divorce. Like, that's not a bad thing, but it certainly shows us that this idea, this fairy tale idea that we've been sold of meeting our one and only and having a lifelong bond with our one and only is a very slim chance. And yet the majority of people are holding that expectation and that desire for themselves. So if anyone tells you that poly is easy, I would question that person. If anyone's ranting and raving about how amazing it is and how great it is and how easy it is, I really question that. I'm not saying that it's not great. I'm not saying that it's not amazing, but I'm certainly saying that it's not easy. It's not an easy relating style. It comes with a hell of a lot of hard work. And if you're the kind of person that enjoys hard work and relationships as an avenue for growth, if you're the kind of person that thrives on opportunities to learn about yourself, then this is a fantastic way of relating. If you're averse to that kind of self-reflection and self-work, then I dare say you'll be averse to poly, because you cannot do poly well and not face parts of yourself that come to light through these dynamics and opportunities. So there's very little literature out there about polydynamics. When you speak to people, or when people are first exploring or learning about the lifestyle and investigating it, there's probably 3 books that would be recommended to you. Now, that is a huge underrepresentation. How many books could we find about relationships and about marriage and about attachment theory that are not relevant to polydynamics? So given that there's very little literature out there, what I find is that often poly is glorified in that literature. And I understand why. And I know they want to portray their lifestyles and their values in the best light to make it appealing and hope to share their message and empower other people to also have poly dynamics in this world where monogamy is normative. But I think in some cases that does an injustice to the full picture and what can also be challenging, and also leaves us without many resources for recourse or for support around those challenging aspects. And when we talk about monogamy and poly, it's not a clear delineation. It's not one or the other. We are vast and varied and amazing human beings, and we exist on a spectrum. And it's the same with heterosexuality and homosexuality. It's not a clear delineation that you're one or the other. They say about 10% of people are strictly heterosexual and about 10% of people are strictly homosexual, and 80% of people exist somewhere on the spectrum. So when we look at the spectrum of monogamy to poly, it's about the same. We have about 10% of people who would be strictly monogamous and about 10% of people who would be strictly poly, and about 80%, the vast majority, would fall somewhere in that gray area in the middle. So what's really important as we step forward into this world, if you choose to, or even if there's people in your world that are doing it, your ability to support and understand the people that you love in making these choices. It's really, really important that we come to know ourselves and understand what poly means to us as an individual, what we want to achieve by being poly, what our standards and our expectations are of being poly, because it doesn't mean that I'm poly, you're poly, we're going to get along, we're going to have a great relationship. It's it can be simplified like that. And I remember back when I used to identify as a lesbian, people would be like, oh, she's a lesbian, you'll be friends with her. Like, well, just because she's a lesbian and I'm a lesbian doesn't actually mean anything. Doesn't mean that we'll be friends, doesn't mean that we'll be attracted to each other, but people can simplify things in that way. And it's kind of the same with poly. Oh, you're poly, he's poly, she's poly, whatever, everyone will get along. Absolutely not the case. My version of poly and your version of poly will be very different. Most likely will be very different, or at least somewhat different. So we need to understand ourselves and what we're seeking so that we can have a strong sense of self and boundaries and standards and healthy relationships with others. And it allows us to negotiate our relationship accurately to make sure that everyone's happy and everyone's needs are going to get met, and we're all here because we're all gaining what we want. If one person is suffering, and if one person is suffering significantly more than anyone else, then we've got a real problem. That's not a sustainable or healthy relationship structure. So when we think about being poly, we're looking at multiple different aspects. We're looking at a sense of romance. We're looking at a sense of sexuality. We're looking at a sense of intimacy. We're looking at a sense of attachment. We're looking at a sense of perhaps parenting or co-parenting. There's so many different aspects of ourself that we bring into relationship, and there's so many different aspects of self that we can share with others. So for some people, being poly might imply that they have different sexual relationships with different people. Now, there's other people who might be happy to have a sexual relationship with one person and deep emotional intimacy with another, but not sexual intimacy, and still consider that to be poly. There's some people that would never be okay with their partner having any form of intimacy with anyone outside of the structure of their relationship. So knowing what we're seeking and who we are and what our needs are is pivotal to entering a poly dynamic. So when my partner and I first met, he was very clear up front that he's poly. He doesn't hide that. He makes sure that it's very clear and that there's no ambiguity around that, so that no one gets hurt. Unfortunately, that has also come with a message that has been, this is who I am, this is how I live, and if that doesn't work for you, then you need to make that decision. that feels like all of the onus and the responsibilities on me. That if I'm not that style of poly, then this relationship can't work. Now, I do identify as poly, and I've had poly experiences from since a young age. And it's hard for me to explain. Like, would I choose to be poly? No fucking way. Would I choose to be bisexual? No fucking way. Do I sometimes wish that I could just have an easy, simplified life? Fuck yes. But I can't. It's who I am. It's not that I think it's a great philosophy and I want to go and experience it, or I want to explore those things. It's a subsequence and a byproduct of being who I am. And I am a vast and varied individual. I have such a wide spectrum inside of me, probably to the point that I haven't met anyone else who shares as many dualities as I do. I am extremely feminine and extremely masculine. I am extremely extroverted and extremely introverted. I need a lot of freedom and a lot of security. I love cats that are like dogs and dogs that are like cats. I like men that are like women and women that are like men. I can't be defined by one thing. So when we come to relationships, I am poly, and there's a part of me that seeks monogamy as well. There's part of me that yearns to be so deeply bonded with my significant other that I have this equal that I share life with, that feels like my teammate, and it's me and you against the world. And I know that you've got my back unwaveringly and I have yours. And that life is enriched by us being a team, and that the burdens of life are eased by us being a team. So there is a feeling of monogamy that I want in my poly dynamics. I can be poly without a sense of monogamy, but I'm going to suffer. I can be monogamous without a sense of poly or openness, but I'm going to suffer. I need to find a way to navigate it in which I get all of my needs met. So being in a relationship where I come up against a fixed and immovable object that says this is how it is and you've got to choose or you're out doesn't work for me. And that doesn't feel equal to me, because I'll work my ass off for a relationship. And, you know, in the period of time that we've been together, I have done more inner work on myself than I have in any other relationship, because it has triggered so much of my stuff. I've had more sleepless nights in this window of time than I've had in my entire life combined. The way that this relationship provides an environment for me to do some deep, deep, deep inner work is like no other. So it comes with an epic amount of reward and an epic price that I pay for that. And so it's a tightrope in which I'm walking all the time of how much pain and suffering and challenge am I willing to face for how much reward. And if those scales get tipped and I'm in more suffering and pain than I am reward, then it's time to leave. But that's a very fine line to walk, without doubt. That's been a very sensitive place for me to exist, because the relationship that I'm seeking is one in which we are equally committed to making it work, that neither of us are rigid, and that it becomes a collaborative effort of finding the way to relate that works for us both, rather than it's my way or the highway, which is a gross simplification. That's certainly not how he speaks to me, but that's the essence of it at the end of the day. And so many people who operate polydynamics have very compartmentalized relationships. Now, you know me. If you show up to this podcast, you know me. I am the most inclusive person. I live the most inclusive life. This podcast is an amalgamation of my personal life, of my business life, of my business is a reflection of my personal life. I am 100% Erin 100% of the time. I do not keep secrets. In fact, I have felt very out of alignment and out of integrity not sharing the struggles of my relationship here on my podcast for numerous reasons, but that doesn't feel right to me. I could never have a secret life. I could never portray one image in public or to my family and then have some secret kinky life behind closed doors. That is absolutely not who I am. My ethos is to own everything about myself. And of course, there's discerning times in which to share parts of myself, and there's times in which to not. But if I had to sequester part of my life in order to exist in the world, I'm going to be extremely unhappy. I can't compartmentalize. It goes against my inherent nature. So with my partner being able to compartmentalize very easily and having a compartment for me to exist in, and then other compartments for me not to exist in, is going against my true nature, which means it's not sustainable for me. I'm not able to adapt into someone else's style of poly in order to make it work. I have to be really clear on my style of poly and be able to come forward and say, this is who I am and this is how I can make it work. And then from there, we can look for common ground. There's no guarantee that that's possible. You know, that goes into way more subtleties than if you're poly or not. I am poly and he's poly, but that doesn't mean that we're compatible. It doesn't mean that the relationship that's satisfying for him is satisfying for me. It doesn't mean that the relationship that's satisfying for me is satisfying for him. He has to question whether he is capable of meeting my needs in the way that I want them to be. And he has to decide if he wants to meet my needs in that way. And that might be the case that he doesn't. If he doesn't wish to make the same commitment to growth that I do, then that's not my equal. And that's a difficult decision to make. And it's not one that either he or I would make lightly, but it requires a lot of self-reflection and a big commitment to grow. And this weekend, he really helped me see myself in a way that I hadn't seen before. And he said he has never met anyone on the planet who exists as their higher self all of the time like I do. And as a result of that, I have very high expectations of others, as I should have, he says. But he doesn't exist in that place all of the time. Even though he has been able to meet me there for the majority of our relationship, he also has the ability to operate as an ordinary version of himself, as do I. However, I don't want to relate in that place. And I don't want to relate to someone's ordinariness when I know that the capacity for greatness is in there. And that doesn't mean I don't love him, and that doesn't mean that I don't respect him and accept all parts of him, but it's a choice that I make based on my relationship values and my relationship expectations. And that also made it perfectly clear to me why past relationships of mine have been unsuccessful. How many times I've met someone who can meet me in that higher place, and it's incredibly rewarding and amazing and magical and otherworldly. But very few people can sustain that energy. And I feel that love with that person. I feel that connection. I get so excited to see each other in that way. And then they retreat and they back away and they get scared. And my partner had pointed this out to me too. He said, yes, I can understand why men find that difficult to maintain around you. And that must be a hard cross for you to bear. And I was like, yes, thank you for pointing that out. That's very, very true. I do expect a lot and I give a lot. Excuse me, I give a lot. So I do want my equal and I do want my match, and I want to relate. I want to create exceptional relationships, and I want to relate with exceptional people. And about 1.5 years ago, I made a vow to not choose men who choose easy. And I had a relationship pattern of meeting men in particular, which is an interesting reflection because my world is surrounded by women who do not choose easy. I surround myself with women who also strive at all times to be their higher self. That was an amazing recognition this conversation gave to me as well. And I love my friends for that. And that's why I choose to have them in my world all the time. But my relationship pattern with men had been to attract a relationship, to connect in that amazing, powerful place, and then for them all to choose easy. And that felt like I was being replaced, and that felt like I was being abandoned. That the hard work that it takes to relate in this place, I get that that's hard work. And for me, it's rewarding because I need that kind of growth. Others would rather choose easy. So I make a standard for myself and a discernment for myself that I don't choose men who choose easy. That's not a rule that I inflict on others. That's not me telling others what to do. That's me having a relationship standard and value that someone must meet in order to come into my space to relate with me. Now, putting rules on each other in a polydynamic is problematic. It's not a healthy way of relating, but understanding our values is really important. Understanding our not negotiables and our preferences. So there might be some not negotiable things like being vegan. You know, one of my friends, my dear friends, is vegan, and she knew that for her to have a long-term partner, for her to consider raising children with someone, that her partner would need to share those values of being vegan. That's a not negotiable for her. For me, it would be a preference. I'm not vegan, but how someone eats would be a preference, that they, you know, my commitment to eating in a way that's healthy and whole foods. My preference would be to not date a vegan, actually, now that I think about it. That would be problematic, but it's not a red flag. It's not a deal breaker for me. So understanding our preferences and understanding our not negotiables are really important in defining our relationship values and expectations. So if you identify as submissive, or if you have an anxious attachment, what tends to happen is that we can subjugate our needs and our values and our standards for the other. That's part of the nature of submission. It is inherent in anxious attachment. We tend to merge into the other person, and we step away from our own values or expectations, or we don't even know what our values and our standards are. And then we try and fit ourselves and adapt ourselves to that thing outside of us. And if we feel a sense of lack in our life, if we're not having our submissive needs met, if we're not feeling loved, if we're not feeling safe, then it can make us overly attached to that source outside of us. So for me, identifying as submissive and identifying as anxious attachment, then it's really important that I understand my values and I stand by them. And I don't just do things the way that he wants to do it. That's going to be a destructive place to exist from, and it's going to erode the sustainability of our relationship. One of the other relationship priorities in general, but even more so in polydynamics, is trust. Trust is built by small, consistent, aligned actions over time based on words and actions aligning. So it's based on integrity, that what you say and what you do is consistent, and it's consistent over a long period of time. And it tends to be from very small acts that build up a sense of trust. And the things that breach trust tend to be instantaneous and in a moment. And a bigger thing can erode months and years of trust building. And it can take months and years to rebuild it again. So when it comes to polydynamics, my ethos, and maybe this is a bit harsh, is words mean nothing and actions mean everything. I don't want you to tell me all the nice words that bring me peace, and I don't want you to paint a picture of what things are going to be when your actions don't say that. Because as soon as those actions are not aligned with the words, all of that trust is eroded. Now that probably is more meaningful for me because I inherently have mistrust based on trauma that I've experienced. particularly trauma around men. So my radar for trust and for mistrust is incredibly refined. So it's important that I don't overly attach to words. I certainly don't pick at things saying you said exactly this thing and then you did this thing. It's not quite that extreme, but it's certainly always there. Well, I built trust based on these statements. You told me it was going to be like this. You offered me this. And you acted like this, which is different. And those moments, as small as they may be, carry so much gravity. So you need to know, stepping into a polydynamic, that you yourself must be trustworthy, that you need to be able to trust yourself and your actions, and you need to make yourself trustable to others by acting in integrity all the time and having no deceit and having no secrecy and being able to own up to mistakes and errors that might have been made. When you can trust yourself wholeheartedly, then you can trust another. And we cannot create a healthy and ongoing and lasting and sustainable polydynamic without trust. So communication, trust, integrity, respect, and love is at the core of polydynamics. And you can get away with a lot more poor behavior in monogamy than you can in poly. I've said this about DS relationships as well, with dominance and submission. In order to get the fullness out of these dynamics, we need to be behaving really well and operating really well and with high integrity, or you don't get the fullness out of it. In monogamy, you can have unhealthy relationship dynamics that last for a long, long time and not even go noticed. But being in poly is like having 100 mirrors held up to you at all times to see yourself and to see your insecurities and your traumas and your mistrust and everything. So if you want that opportunity, it is an amazing, amazing avenue for self-growth. And if you want something more comfortable, perhaps poly is not the way to go. So in summary, it really comes down to your awareness of yourself. There is so much range between monogamy and poly. You do not have to have multiple sexual partners. You do not have to have, like when you think about the most extreme model of poly, there is so much between there and monogamy. You and your partner can open your relationship just slightly. You can explore in the realm of fantasy, or you may be allowed to flirt with others, or you may be allowed to play with others together. It's about working out between the two of you what's comfortable, where are your limits. If you don't want to work through your stuff, you might have very small limits. It's going to take you into your stuff, undoubtedly. It's your decision how you want to deal with that, and if you want to work through it and where that limit is. So get really clear on who you are, what you want, what your needs and what your expectations are, and take that into your relationship negotiations. Don't just assume that someone else's way of doing it is the right way for you. Don't just assume that your way of doing it has to be right for another. It's all a beautiful state of flow and exploration of ourselves and other through the vehicle of relationships. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, my friends. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. Please let me know what you loved about this episode, what challenged you about this episode. And if you've got any questions, please share the love, share this episode with someone you love, share the love on Instagram. Come and ask me any questions that you have, and make sure that you subscribe. As always, laugh loud and fuck louder.